They were relieved of close guard part of the way through the night, and Osrith instructed her men to get rest and food. They would need it if they were called upon the next day or night, or both. Osrith watched as they headed towards the kitchens, still in their new uniforms, and she smiled, watching as Elfkin was greeted by one of the palace maids, with a kiss on the cheek before she handed him a folded set of clothes. He was one of her most able soldiers, and he was using his easygoing affability to procure himself fresh cooked food and laundry done, with a flirt and a wink. She hoped he did heed her words, and did sleep, and she saw Elfrith follow the rest of her company into the kitchen, making a glance towards the happy young bear, perhaps remembering his own wife. When she arrived back at her own small house, and lay down on her own bed, Osrith's eyes just would not close. So much was on her mind, not least that she had ingratiated herself into a rebellion. Osrith got up, and yielded to her own advice by making her way to the kitchens. It was busy that night, with a number of guards waiting to be fed, and she saw that each of her men were sitting down to plates of food and jugs of ale, Elfkin with his maid flitting about him, adoringly. Other companies were there too, and she noticed long looks from a table across from her men, though nothing came of it, for they too were eating well. Osrith. She turned to see Miral crossing the flagstones and ushering her off her feet. You must be exhausted. Here, sit. I will bring you food. Osrith was grateful, but not in the mood to talk much, so she listened to Miral tell her about the fights subdued just north of Aylesbury, Seashes. Osrith wondered, though Miral did not name it, and another, nearby Suister, north of Oxford. Not long after, Miral was summoned by Eardwulf just as he was getting into the topic of whether cheese made near Gloucester was superior to that made near Cester, and Osrith stood, a little shakily, it had to be said, as Elfkin's maid cleared her place. She was a slender little thing, buttered blonde hair falling to her waist and a merry face, with a little button of a nose, and she smiled at Osrith nervously, and when she had moved, Miral and Eardwulf had gone. As far as Osrith was concerned, Miral and Eardwulf were not friends, were not allies in any way, yet now she knew of the bid for keeping Mercia independent. Were they talking about a common interest? She should sleep, Osrith told herself, as the heat from the candles and the many bodies eating supper made her head spin, and she got up, a little too quickly, kicking her boot against the bench, before making her way outside. The cool night air had a hint of winter's chill that night. October, blood month, was closing in fast. Soon the stores in Aylesbury would be full of meat, ready for feasting, ready for salting and preserving for the lean, early spring months, and she walked around the courtyard in front of the stables before skipping in. Was it her boots sliding on moist straw that drew Aldhelm's attention? For he was standing beside Osrith not long after, greeting her warmly, though tiredly. Did Miral not provide you with lodging, like you had in Winchester? Aldhelm asked. Typical Aldhelm, propriety, correctness, before all else, assuming that she was coming in the stables to make for the loft above. Yes, Osrith replied, clapping him on the shoulder. But I find my head so full of intrigue that I cannot find rest. And I had to check I had not dreamed you. Aldhelm chuckled, then sank into a pile of clean straw near the back gates of the stable. A small hatch was open and the blessed evening breeze was circulating cool air. Osrith leaned back, giving a little screech, shocked, as 2 rats ran from the straw when she moved it. The situation is dire, Aldhelm told her, and let her lean against him as he talked into the blackness. Edward has taken charge, nothing happens without his permission or, more accurately, Ethelham's, under the guise of his protecting Mercia. Osrith felt the man sigh as she closed her eyes, listening to his words, and Aldhelm placed a comforting hand over hers. My brother, Aldwin fought in my stead. I stood, disguised, beside my lady Ethelfled. Osrith leaned away, and turned to look at him. It was nearly black where they were, but the light from the gibbous moon illuminated Aldhelm's face. She had cried real tears for him. How could he have just hidden himself away? But then, hadn't she? Alba was so very far away that her disappearance would be as good as dying to those people she had left behind. Utad is your brother? Aldhelm asked Osrith of her admission. I must admit, that is not a very healthy fact to be in the possession of. He knows, and he hates me as much as I hate him, Osrith replied. I did not suggest him for any other reason than it makes a lot of sense. His mother was Mercen. We have the same father. He can command men. Though it galled her to say it. There had been so many times Osrith had wished him dead. But, as well as an advantage for Mercia, there were other positives. It would keep him near Ethelfled and thus keep him away from Bibbenberg. She could return to Wigger, instill an idea of legacy in him. He could remarry, have children. With Uhtred kept so busy with Mercia it would keep him from Bibbenberg forever. He is a pagan, Aldhelm said. Would he renounce his ways and become Christian again? Mercens would require nothing less. If he wanted it enough, he would. He has an ego big enough. And Osrith went on to tell Aldhelm of her flight to Alba, rescuing Edra and placing her somewhere safe. You are a good person, to do all that, Aldhelm told Osrith. I stole all of Uhtred's silver, Osrith replied, demonstrating that he was wrong. Constantine does not do things for nothing. But Edra is safe for the rest of her life there. And Winchester? Did you return? I have returned, Osrith admitted, although it took me a good deal of preparation of my mind to do so. You know that I was accused of being a witch. I had heard. But who I heard it from was the Lord Ethelwold, so I took no heed. Osrith felt for Aldhelm's hand in the darkness, and touched it softly for the moment. For the first time in so long, she felt a relief in her chest about the rumours told about her in Wessex, spread, presumably, through Alba and the Danes. Here was a man Osrith respected giving her his assurance of her character. I took Edra to see her father, Father Bicker, when I learned he was dying. Edra, Aldhelm mused, saying the girl's name a few times. Edra. Edra. He turned to Osrith. It is a nice name. You have heard it before, Osrith suggested. Perhaps at Saltwick? In the Lady Ethelfled's papers? Aldhelm turned to look at Osrith in the gloom, his mouth falling open. I knew that Booker's effects, some of them at least, had been sent to her. And she liked the name too, so much so that it took her no time at all to find out who Edra was. But, you just said. Not Thyra and Booker's daughter, Osrith corrected him, and gave a laugh. That was my name, once. My Christian name. Your name? Aldhelm repeated. Yes, she agreed. All the way to Alba, and Irian, and then Wessex, Osrith added. An accusation of witchcraft. I did hear something of that, admitted Aldhelm. But I could never think it of you. It is always the quiet ones, Osrith replied. Then that definitely rules you out, Aldhelm quipped back. Osrith shook her head. I am for Alba, but I now seem to be of Mercia again. And no bad thing, Aldhelm replied, as he sat back again, and Osrith felt herself lean against him. Tiredness was coming to her now. Must you return? Aldhelm asked, suddenly. I must, said Osrith, but not immediately. Not until I have enough intelligence for Constantine, at any rate, though she probably had it now. It was Aldhelm who shook Osrith awake the next morning, and she realized that she had slept on the horse's fodder. Climbing to her feet, she was not surprised to see Miral beside Aldhelm, talking quietly to one another. Above them, the loft emptied of men, and they climbed down the ladders and into the stableyard, washing and getting themselves ready for the day, shifting gentials with their hands, scratching asses, and generally just getting up. Her own company, Osrith noted, were indeed the most well presented, and Miral called to them all to eat, and then return for sword practice. There had been a big dispute the day before between the Mercen and West Saxon guards as to where they could practice, which again had to be sorted by Stieper and Deirdgulf. A compromise had been reached in the end, but it made Osrith feel sad that rather than change practice times, why couldn't they all train together? They were all there together for the same end, were they not? Then, Osrith chided herself on being a unionist, when she had just become a supporter of rebellion against King Edward, although a part of herself knew it made sense to train together, as she had done with so many warriors when she had been in Wessex herself. When the last man was down, Osrith saw Aldhelm slip through a hinged hatchway which was, up until then, just a door and nothing to suggest that it made to go on upwards. Miral stood by the door, an empty board in his hand. She had also just noticed that he and Elfrith had exchanged eye contact with one another, Osrith's deputy giving Miral a small, happy smile. "I could not sleep," Osrith told Miral, who had crossed to her, pulling a few bits of straw off her. "I was going to say, a tumble in the hay, but the situation is too critical for me to even begin to joke," he replied. "There is a plan, and we must carry it out, tonight, if it had a chance of succeeding," Miral told her. "It needs to be done fast, and with precision. If anyone, Steeper, the Wessex nobles, King Edward, anyone, finds out anything, all we have done will have come to naught. It relies on you being on close guard, by any chance?" Osrith replied, her words dull. "Yes," Miral agreed, "but it is happening tonight." "What is?" "You will know when you know," he replied, mysteriously. "It will be ... obvious. And it will require Eddie horses and a ride northeast. Does that help?" "Not in the slightest. So I ride northeast." "You and your company," Miral corrected her. He then put a hand on Osrith's shoulder. "Aldhelm did not mention your ... condition," Miral cautioned her. "He has not adjusted his plans for you." "And nor should he," Osrith bit back, hotly, though was instantly sorry, realizing that the lack of sleep and hunger were affecting her more than she realized. "Sorry, Miral," she began again. "I am not dying, and no, he is not going to, at all, ever. And I will be no liability to your plan. If I thought I was going to be, I would." "I know you would, Osrith," Miral replied, soothingly. "I do not consider you any less of a warrior, and you are aware of your limits, even now," he added. "Listen," he continued, "we are going to entice Eadgilf out of Aylesbury, then spring trap. He must not be here when we launch our coup. Marrying Elfwin is a ruse, and we are encouraging him to search for her, one that Eadgilf believed so strongly in now that he would be easy to manipulate. That is the plan. You need to get your men in Eadgilf's orbit, and ensure that when he flies, you, all 5 of you, are with him. Pretend you are loyal to him, anything to be with him if you must, just go." "Understood," Osrith said, and was almost frog-marched into the kitchens by Miral to eat something before being called to the chamber of Lord Ethliad, to stand close guard to him again. 88,888,888. Then, things happened at pace. The sun, which had found a way to penetrate even this holed-up proto-tomb, reached its fingers through some gaps in the ceiling, and illuminated a pattern onto the rich carpet. It gave Osrith something to look at to take her mind of the dying man in front of her, off his mistress, who was growing thinner and sitting every hour that she could holding the man's hand. She looked at the dust motes flash in and out of the rays, then back to her men, who were standing so still it put Osrith to shame. Just as Osrith had resigned herself to more hours of this inertia, the door was flung open and a woman entered, striding her long legs over the carpet and standing at the foot of Lord Ethliad's bed. As if sensing her presence, Ethliad opened his eyes, weakly, and beside him, Edith pulled back her hand and folded it within her other, as if caught doing something she shouldn't, which Osrith considered was a fair point. "I must be dying," came a voice from between 2 dry lips. "Otherwise you would not be here." "Wife." Ethliad almost spat the last word at Ethelfled, and jerked forward a little, disturbing the clots and scabs which adhered to his scalp and his hair as he coughed, blood beginning to leach from his wound. Osrith's heart ran to pity to see him, as his cold-faced, indifferent spouse lingered at the end of his bed. "I have come about our daughter," Ethelfled began. "I have come to hear your decision on her spouse." "He will be ruler of Mercia," Ethliad said, "when I am gone," and he leaned forward again. "Which cannot be long, Ethelfled, which can only delight you." "Name him," Ethelfled was to the point. "Name him, so the kingdom can have a future again." And Osrith was quite sure that she saw the man try to smile. He held out a hand, then let it fall into his lap. "No," Ethliad replied. "She is to marry no one. Let one of the lords take my place." And as he said that, a groan like the waking of the dead came from his body, along with a quantity of feces, which oozed down the bed and began to soak into the bedding. Ethelfled turned on her heel, an expression on her face that suggested that Ethelred was entirely at fault for being in that state and that he wasn't helping anybody by dying. But, as Osrith was to find out when she followed the Lady of Mercia, and saw her flop against the wall of the corridor, hands in her hair, frustration and despair on her features. But they were not there for long, for, when she turned when she saw Osrith, and drew her hands to her sides. As she did so, a small cloth fell from her wrist, drifting slowly down like a sail to the flagstones. "Pick that up," she demanded. Osrith stepped over it and stood before Ethelfled. "If you both wish Elfwin to remain unmarried, you need to leave the city, ride, and take her somewhere safe." "And just why should I listen to you?" Ethelfled demanded. "Because I am the one who can get you out of this city." "Why would I want to get out? This is my home, nobody wishes to harm Elfwin." "I did not say harm, I said marry," Osrith replied, caustically, "although I understand why you could not tell the difference." Ethelfled drew up her hand as if to strike her, but then lowered it again when Osrith remained standing in front of her, still silent. "I can go on my own, if I should choose," she rebuked Osrith, who remained in front of her. "And the reason you are not in a monastery is because—" Ethelfled narrowed her eyes. "Did you hope to lie with my husband, Osrith Lackland, because I am sorry to say he pisses down his leg and has to be spoon-fed much like an infant? It is only you who believes I had designs on your husband, yet I swore to fight for Mercia." This time, Ethelfled's expression changed to one of derision. "Why would you?" scoffed Ethelfled, turning up the corners of her mouth in triumph. "You are of Northumbria or, possibly, Halligwithakland." She knew. Ost was shaken, but only for a second. "I am of Bernicia, Alba and Irian too, yet, who are you? My ancestors were kings while yours weren't even fighting Britons or Sentishmen." She took a step towards Osrith, hand in close proximity to tagged Sikhs. Ethelfled looked down, but saw no threat. She heard one, though, as the metal of the blade chinked by the steel rivets holding its hilt together. Enough of a threat. "So, who is to be king of Mercia?" Osrith asked. "The next lord of Mercia is to be decided at the Witan," Ethelfled replied stiffly. "And, do you want to know what has been decided?" Osrith drew herself to Ethelfled's face. "Because I have, everyone." That must have stung. As a woman, no matter how noble, Osrith was not allowed to be in the Witan, unless invited. She did not wait for Ethelfled's answer and pressed on, ignoring the groan from beyond them, in the chamber. "Lord Ethelred's daughter is to marry Eardwulf," Osrith lied, and the shock on Ethelfled's face was enough to tell her that this was the time, this was the moment. Was she right? It would appear so. Ethelfled gave a strained look to the door of her husband's chamber, before hurrying at speed towards the courtyard, not stopping even to say something back to Osrith. At the same time, from the other entrance, Eardwulf paced towards her, then glanced at the Lord Ethelred's door. Another groan, and Osrith peered past Eardwulf to see Ethelred's left contort, stiffen, as pain gripped him. "You, stay here," Eardwulf ordered, and he pulled Oshir, Eglwulf and Elfkin from the room. Behind him, the captain of another guard, Hayard, was approaching him, as did Baird, who Eardwulf ordered to close guard. "A healer will be coming shortly, Hayard, send your men to relieve these." He gestured towards Osrith's warriors. But there was no need for a guard for the Lord of Mercia. Now, Osrith could see, his legs had relaxed, as had his body, as if some great hand that had been squeezing his torso had finally released him from its grasp. Ethelred was dead. "Hayard." Eardwulf called the captain, and the young man stood before his commander. "Call more guard, this room needs to be kept secure." "Yes, my lord," Hayard replied, obediently, and Osrith watched as he hurried up the corridor to the stableyard, where many of the mercenaries would now be practicing with their swords. "I can stay," Osrith proposed. "We can guard him." Eardwulf turned on Osrith and bent his neck towards her, his hair damp from perspiration that had begun to drip down his nose. "You will be suspected," Eardwulf shot back, his words. "Questioned at least, being the guard close to my lord when he died." But, already sickness was beginning to well in Osrith's stomach, and it wasn't altogether to do with her condition. "I will advocate for you," Eardwulf pressed, "but you will need to come with me. I have a special task that I need to accomplish to maintain order in the kingdom. Do you understand?" Osrith nodded dumbly, which was mostly an act as she suspected Eardwulf's task, and she called her men to her. "You will do as the Lord Eardwulf commands, for the sake of Lord Ethlied," she told them, and, at his word, they all made haste to the stables, for beasts upon which to ride, and to the gates to have them flung open. But, there was no need for the gates, they were already open, and coming down the steps of the front of the hall was the King of Wessex, imperious in emerald green, arms folded, Ethelm by his side. "Our beloved lady has fled the city," he declared, and Osrith turned her head to look. So had many other people, and Shay urged Oshir to continue to bring the horses round to the entrance in case they had to make a run for it. Ahead of them, Eardwulf had commandeered Hayad again, and the captain had been given the task of saddling up Eardwulf's own black horse. The beast was not happy to be disturbed from slumber and was scratching its hooves into the soft mud as the hapless Hayad fumbled with the reins and halter. "And I will fetch her back." Eardwulf's voice rang out amongst the stones of the city as he leapt for his horse's saddle. "Such grief she must be feeling at the death of her husband, that she has fled for solitude. I will persuade her to return." A bubbling of sound erupted amongst those who happened to be in Aylesbury's market square, at the announcement of the death of the Lord of Mercia, and many of them fixed their eyes on Eardwulf, as he summoned Osrith, with Egelfrith, Elfkin and Oshir on steeds of their own. Osrith caught Miral's eye as she made to follow, but he showed no encouragement or opposition. To her, that was enough, and she was not surprised, when the ringing of the bell came from behind them, minutes later, that they were being followed by Elfrith. They were pursuing Eardwulf at speed, and Osrith jolted over stone and tussock as Morningstar fought to keep up, Osrith fighting to keep on her back, until finally, some miles from the city, Eardwulf drew to a stop. It was then that Osrith realized Hayad was also with them, and she breathed heavily a few times to prevent herself from vomiting and made to concentrate on Eardwulf's voice as he spoke to them. She must have looked devoted, for Eardwulf smiled, indulgently, at all of them. "Men of Mercia," Eardwulf nodded to them. "You are in the very fortunate position that I have chosen you for a task of such import that it will decide the future of Mercia, no less. Kill me now." Elfrith hissed to Osrith under his breath, and it was all Osrith could do to stop herself from bursting into laughter. "You are loyal, obedient men of Mercia," continued Eardwulf, "and, as was declared by the Witan, I am to be your next lord." If her men had been shocked, Osrith did not detect in, and she waited for Eardwulf to continue. "I am to marry the Lady Elfwin, the Lady Ethelflaed's daughter," he continued, "in order to maintain the Lord Ethlied's bloodline in Mercia. To keep it independent of Wessex. To ensure we do not become a vassal state to Wessex." "Hurrah!" came a voice, and Osrith saw Hayad championing their Lord Commander. It would be you, Osrith thought, for she had never witnessed an original thought or deed from that young man when he was a child serving Odda, though that did not disbar him from being a stolid captain. "The Lady Ethelflaed has gone to prepare her daughter for this monumental role," Eardwulf continued, smiling widely, as if impressed with his own assumed importance. "So you will be the guards who accompany the Lord and Lady of Mercia back to Aylesbury. Think what esteem the other guards will hold you in." And that was it. They were going to Saltwick, Eardwulf told them, for that would be where the Lady Elfwin would be. Doubtful, Osrith thought, as she rode beside Elfrith. Ethelflaed would never leave her daughter somewhere so prominent, for just this reason. "What do you think the silver and bronze was for, fool?" snarled Elfkin that night, when they camped at Bycaster, within the ruins of the old Roman fort. Eardwulf had dragged Egelfrith and Oshir with him on guard duty, pleased with his own importance, and Elfrith had discussed the rebellion plans, forgetting, perhaps, that Hayad had not been party to them. There was no love lost between Elfkin and Heard, for the latter had designs on the same woman, Elfrith told Osrith, who was clearly besotted with Elfkin. And they moved on the next day to within 5 miles of the Saltwick, the line of mountains on the horizon demarking an ancient boundary between them and the Welsh, although Offa had dug his deep earthworks further east than the mountains. No Welshman could ride his horse directly into Mercia since. So Eardwulf called Osrith and Heard, his guard captains, beside him, and began to instruct them on what they were to do to gain entry to Saltwick, and what to do when they found the Lady Ethelfled and her daughter. "You are not to kill any men, though they will try to kill you," Eardwulf continued, pompously, before giving them positions in which to enter Saltwick. They were to storm the kitchen gate, which would result in a greater siege if the men inside the palace had realized they were under attack. But something was wrong. The place seemed too quiet, too few men stood guard around the estate's perimeter. "Do as the Lord Eardwulf commands," Osrith cautioned her men, as she led them around to the trees at the back, where there should definitely be men above as lookouts eyeballing her as she was eyeballing the ramparts. "But be aware, it may be a trap." Elfrith, with Ossier and Elfkin, took off further to the left, where a small brook flowed past the back of the fortifications, as Eglfrith and Osrith moving back towards where they had come. "No," Osrith commanded as Eglfrith made to step out towards the line of the rear gates, and was glad she did so because a whoosh of arrows spat their way into the soft mud near his feet. 2 arrows, so 2 guards at least. "Get to the walls, can you shin up?" Eglfrith, tall and rangy, gave Osrith a withering look. "Of course, Captain," he replied, with a grin. "Question is, can you?" It was a question intended as a cheeky response to Osrith's order. But, Osrith thought, she may not, as a wave of nausea welled in her stomach. "You try and stop me," she replied, and as Eglfrith took off across the dark shrouded soil, Osrith threw up what was left in her stomach of the venison they had eaten that day, arrowed by Elfkin and butchered by him and Heard, who proved he was useful after all. She ran after him, seeing a pair of feet rise above her as her hands rested against the wooden walls. Now, they should be under attack, Osrith thought, as she maneuvered herself up the side to one of the overhanging struts that supported a sheltered walkway. Not that she wasn't grateful that she wasn't being peppered with arrows, Osrith considered, as she pulled herself up. Already, Eglfrith was racing along the walkway, heading in the direction of the main gates, and from the opposite side, Osrith could just make out another figure, possibly Ossier, as he approached the gates too. Between them the 2 warriors opened the gate, pulling on the ropes that allowed both doors to swing backwards. She had been there already, Osrith concluded, Ethelfled. She had been there and emptied Saltwick of every living person. Not even any servants to tend the livestock, if there were indeed livestock about, which Osrith considered unlikely, for there was little odour as would usually be in the courtyard, no horses stamped idly in their stalls. Not on her own, Osrith thought, scoffing the thought, and knew this had the features of something Uhtred would do. The children, with her brother and his men, and Ethelfled, would be well on their way to wherever they were going. Damn. Eardwulf rode through Saltwick and looked about him, as Osrith beckoned her warriors down, and through the open gates she could see the tree far back at the end of the main trail where their horses were tied. No luck, Osrith told her men, as they descended the fortifications, and she too swung herself down, ignoring the dizziness in her head. "Oh, I would not say that," Eardwulf said, as he got off his horse. "We can start by searching Ethelfled's estate, confiscate all we can carry, for it all belongs to the Lord Ethelred," and he gestured towards the inner doors, and gestured to Elfrith to begin breaking his way in. None of it belonged to Ethelred anymore, Osrith thought wryly, and as she strode over to help her men, a thought occurred. If Eardwulf believed he was de facto Lord of Mercia, on the search for his absent bride-to-be, then, by extension, Saltwick was also his. Had he just staged his own invasion to gain entry? She looked about her again. Gain entry to an abandoned estate? Something just did not add up here. Crossing the courtyard, Osrith made for her men. Whatever was going on there, she was determined to be near the front, to lead them, to protect them from whatever plot was happening. And then she felt Buet skid from her hand. Osrith turned as a blade came at her again, and she turned, swiftly, reaching for Tagd-Seeks, but could not swing her arm enough to wield it. "If you want your captain to live," Eardwulf shouted across to Osrith's warriors, as they stopped with their good progress through the doors, with Oshir claiming entry by being the one to smash the crude pinion across the inside of the doors, and the basic gear mechanism crumbled to the floor. The men did not care anymore about their competition about who was going to be the first to break in. What they did care about was that Eardwulf was holding a knife to Osrith's throat. "Did you think I did not know it was you?" The man snarled near her ear, then brought the blade away from Osrith, and challenged the man, probably Elfkin, although Osrith could not discern from the angle the commander was twisting her neck. "Upstart bitch, to think she could do a man's work." "I have done a man's work," Osrith replied, "many times over." She glanced at her men. "Do you think any warrior would follow a woman unless she had proved herself?" The blade nicked Osrith's skin just below her ear, but she pressed on, her hand trying to reach her hip, as she kept him talking. "Whatever did you think I was going to do to your sister all those years ago?" she added, provoking him. Just out of reach, Osrith thought, as her fingers brushed its leather scabbard. "You will find me the Lady Elfwin, so I can be the Lord of Mercia," Eardwulf explained slowly, as if talking to a child. "I will do such thing," Osrith retorted, swallowing as she felt the blade nick her neck. Blood trickled down it, and she heard Elfrith's voice in protest as a shmmm of swords leaving sheaths sounded around her. "Your lady dies if you come close," threatened Eardwulf, as Osrith crept a hand carefully down her leg, this time managing to catch her finger over Tagd-Seeks for a moment. Progress, she thought. "Keep him talking." "I am no lady," Osrith retorted. "I am a captain, and I have been a Gaelish warrior. Danes and Norse know me as Kriegekvind." But it seemed that that honored title meant nothing to Eardwulf, as he turned again to her warriors. "Do your men know you are Lord Uthod's sister?" he asked her, loudly enough for all to hear. "Some," Osrith conceded, "and I hate him more than any Dane." And there she managed it, her once hand-wed husband's blade coming to her rescue once again as she got a good grip in its handle and looped it over her hand, aiming it towards Eardwulf, where she stopped it at the point of a slight but insistent pressure on his stomach. He lowered his blade and she stepped away from him, looking towards Buie. Oshir noticed, and he bent to pick it up before handing it to her. Osrith gave him a beaming smile as her sword came to rest just above his heart. "And because I hate him, and I hate her, I'll help you," Osrith thought. Otherwise, there was no plan, no direction, for she was running blindly out of her depth without being in full possession of the facts. What she did know was that to find the Lady Elfwin meant they would find Ethelfled and perhaps her brother, and it would use time up in which more facts would become apparent. "Miral," she shouted to him, silently, "why couldn't you have told me of the whole rebellion plan? There was no reason for you and Eardwulf to be talking covertly to one another. Otherwise, my gamble could be a huge mistake here." "Are you for Mercia, Lord Eardwulf?" Osrith asked, aware of every one of her men, and Heod too, staring at her. "Independent of Wessex?" And here, Eardwulf gave her a frown, which Osrith took to mean, of course. What else? Because that was the point, however unpalatable, that a Mercian needed to rule, otherwise there would be civil war, and open season for all Danes and Northmen to help themselves. "Tell us, all here, declare it," she demanded, when Eardwulf said nothing and, as a mark of trust, she thrust Buie point down into the ground. Eardwulf reached over his shoulder and pulled out his own blade. A gasp came from behind her, as it came close to Osrith's ear, but she did not flinch, and instead watched as the man mimicked her gesture and matched Buie with his own. Both blades oscillated between them,